For centuries, the resurrection of Jesus has been told through four familiar gospel accounts. But what if parts of that story were remembered elsewhere, preserved quietly, outside the pages most Christians know? Deep within the Ethiopian biblical tradition, ancient texts describe moments surrounding the resurrection that appear in no other gospel. They were not hidden as secrets. They were simply remembered differently. These passages do not challenge the resurrection. They do not rewrite it. Instead, they fill the silence between the cross and the empty tomb, describing reactions, movements, and witnesses that the canonical Gospels chose not to record. Why were these details preserved in but lost elsewhere? What does that tell us about how early Christians remembered Jesus? And what happens to our understanding of the resurrection when forgotten voices are finally heard? To understand why resurrection details appear in Ethiopian texts and nowhere else, we first need to understand how Ethiopian Christianity developed differently from Western Christianity. Christianity reached Ethiopia very early, traditionally in the 4th century, but it did not grow under the same pressures that shaped the Roman and later European churches. It was not filtered through imperial councils, political compromise, or standardized theological debates in the same way. Instead, Ethiopian Christianity formed in relative isolation, rooted in oral memory, liturgy, and continuity of tradition. The Ethiopian Bible reflects this difference clearly. Its canon is significantly larger than the Western canon and includes books that were never fully accepted or were later set aside in Europe and the Mediterranean world. These texts were not viewed as alternative or heretical. They were simply part of the inherited faith. Another crucial factor is language. Many Ethiopian scriptures were preserved in Ge'ez, a liturgical language that stabilized early and resisted later editorial revision. While Greek and Latin texts were copied, revised, and sometimes harmonized over centuries, Ethiopian manuscripts tended to preserve older narrative layers with less pressure to streamline them. Most importantly, Ethiopian Christianity never separated oral tradition from written authority as sharply as the West did. What was remembered in worship, recited in community, and passed down by trusted teachers remained meaningful, even if it was never reduced to a tightly edited gospel narrative. This does not mean Ethiopian texts are more accurate in a modern historical sense. It means they preserved memory differently. And that difference is exactly why resurrection details survived there when they disappeared elsewhere. In the next section, we will look at what these Ethiopian resurrection passages actually describe and why they feel so unfamiliar to modern readers, despite fitting naturally within the early Christian world. When readers first encounter the Ethiopian resurrection passages, the most striking thing is not what they claim, but what they focus on. These texts do not spend time proving that Jesus rose from the dead. That fact is already assumed. Instead, they turn their attention to the hours and moments surrounding the resurrection, the space between death and dawn that the canonical Gospels largely leave quiet. In these accounts, the world does not remain still while Jesus lies in the tomb. Creation reacts, the spiritual realm moves. There is an awareness that something irreversible is happening, even before the stone is rolled away. Rather than centering the story on the women discovering the empty tomb, these passages describe what was unfolding while no human witnesses were present. Some texts speak of the earth responding, darkness lifting, barriers breaking, unseen forces shifting. Others describe angelic presence not as a sudden appearance at the tomb, but as an ongoing activity tied to the moment of resurrection itself. The emphasis is not spectacle, but cosmic consequence. What makes these passages feel unfamiliar is their point of view. The canonical Gospels are written from human memory, what disciples saw, heard, feared, or misunderstood. Ethiopian resurrection texts often step outside that frame. They ask, what was happening beyond human sight? What was moving before anyone arrived at the tomb? Importantly, these descriptions do not contradict the Gospels. They do not change who discovered the empty tomb or how faith spread afterward. They simply describe what the Gospel writers chose not to narrate, possibly because no one was there to see it, or because their focus lay elsewhere. To modern readers, this feels unusual, but in the early Christian world, such storytelling was normal. Communities remember Jesus not only through eyewitness testimony, but through theological memory, how events were understood to affect heaven, earth, and history itself. This raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. If these details were remembered and repeated by early believers, why were they never written into the Gospels we now call Scripture? That is where the story turns next. The absence of these resurrection details from the canonical Gospels is often misunderstood. Many assume that if something is not written in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, it must have been rejected, suppressed, or considered untrue. The historical reality is far simpler and far more human. The Gospel writers were not trying to record everything that was believed about Jesus. They were trying to preserve what was necessary. Each Gospel was written for a specific community facing specific pressures. These were small, vulnerable groups living under suspicion, persecution, and constant instability. Writing materials were rare. Literacy was limited. Every line mattered. The Gospels focus on what early Christians needed most: who Jesus was, what he taught, how he suffered, and why his resurrection mattered for salvation. Details that could not be confirmed by eyewitnesses were often left unwritten, not because they were disbelieved, but because they could not be defended if challenged. A Roman official could question an empty tomb. A Jewish authority could dispute testimony from named witnesses. But cosmic movements, unseen actions, or spiritual reactions had no courtroom defense. There is also the question of memory versus proclamation. Many resurrection-related traditions were not meant to be argued. They were meant to be remembered. They circulated in worship, prayer, and storytelling, not as doctrine to be proven, but as meaning to be shared. Over time, as Christianity became more organized and text-centered, these oral layers began to fade. Ethiopian Christianity resisted that shift longer than most. While Western churches increasingly treated written texts as the sole authority, Ethiopian tradition allowed remembered events to remain meaningful even without formal inclusion in Scripture. This does not imply that the Gospel writers were incomplete or deceptive. It suggests they were disciplined. They drew boundaries not around truth, but around what could be responsibly written in a fragile world. Understanding this helps explain why Ethiopian resurrection accounts feel both foreign and familiar at the same time. They come from the same early Christian soil, but they grew in a different direction. Next, we must ask what this difference reveals about how faith survived before Christianity became safe, public, and institutional. In the earliest centuries, Christianity survived not because it was well documented, but because it was well remembered. Most believers could not read. Many would never see a gospel manuscript in their lifetime. What they knew about Jesus lived in repetition, through prayers, shared meals, and stories told again and again under conditions that were often dangerous. In that environment, not every remembered detail needed to become scripture. Some memories served a different purpose. They helped believers understand what kind of world the resurrection created, even if no one could prove how every moment unfolded. The Ethiopian tradition preserved this older way of remembering longer than most Christian communities. Faith was not divided into what is written versus what is believed. What mattered was whether a memory aligned with the character of Jesus, the meaning of the resurrection, and the lived experience of the community. Over time, as Christianity gained legal protection and institutional structure, this balance shifted. Written text became the center of authority. Oral traditions, especially those that could not be anchored to named witnesses, slowly lost their place, not because they were false, but because they were unmanageable in a system that demanded clarity, consistency, and defense. This shift changed how resurrection was understood. The focus narrowed to what could be safely narrated: the empty tomb, the appearances, the commissioning of disciples. What happened in the silence, the moment when no one was watching, was allowed to fade. Ethiopian Christianity never fully made that trade. It continued to hold space for memory that explained meaning rather than evidence. That is why its resurrection texts feel less like reports and more like reflections preserved as truth. This brings us to the final question. What do we do with these remembered voices now, centuries after they were set aside? The Ethiopian resurrection texts do not ask us to rewrite the Gospels. They do not compete with Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Instead, They remind us that the resurrection was not only an event to be witnessed, but a reality that reshaped everything, seen and unseen. Early Christians did not experience faith through documents alone. They lived it through memory, trust, and shared meaning. Some of those memories were written down. Others were carried forward quietly, preserved in places far from centers of power. Ethiopia became one of those places. What we are encountering now is not lost scripture, but lost perspective. A way of understanding the resurrection that focuses less on proof and more on consequence. Less on what can be defended and more on what was believed to be true because it changed everything. This raises a final, unavoidable question. If early believers trusted these memories enough to preserve them for centuries, what else might we be missing? Not because it was false, but because it did not fit the way faith later learned to speak. That question is now yours.